The teller was young and had never seen anything like it, so she did the only thing she knew to do. She called her manager. Opal Renfrew had walked into the branch a little after 9, small and slow in a coat older than the teller, and set an old blue mason jar on the counter and slid it forward without a word. It was heavy. It rang against the marble. Inside, packed tight and gone dull gold in the fluorescent light, were coins, dozens of them, thick and round, not the kind anybody spends. The teller, whose name tag said Nadine, stared at it, and then at the old woman, and then she picked up the phone. "I need Mr. Loomis up front," she said quietly. "Right now." Opal folded her hands on the counter and waited. The way she'd learned to wait for most things worth having, which is to say without any fuss at all. Because what Nadine couldn't have known, what nobody in that branch knew, watching the old farm woman stand patient at the counter, was that the jar held 60 years. 1 coin for every harvest Opal Renfrew had brought in alone, and 1 for every harvest she'd brought in before that with Wes. Back when the two of them were young and the land was new and a man had made her a promise about how a farm gets saved. She was 79. She had farmed the Renfrew place by herself for 31 years since Wes died, and the county had a settled idea about her. A poor old widow scraping by on 80 acres, too stubborn to sell, too proud to ask. Driving a truck older than most of the men at the feed store and buying her groceries careful. They weren't unkind about it, they were just sure. Old Opal, out there alone, getting by on nothing. They pitied her the way you pity weather you can't change. They had it exactly backward, and it started with Wes. Wesley Renfrew had come home from the service in the 50s with nothing but a wife and a down payment, and he'd stood in the first field they ever owned and told Opal the thing he'd tell her every autumn for the rest of his short life. He didn't trust banks, and he didn't trust good years. He'd watched his own father lose a farm in a loud season, borrowing against a boom that broke. And he'd made up his mind that the Renfrews would be saved by the opposite thing, by smallness, by patience, by refusing to spend the way other men spent when the getting was good. Every fall, when the crop sold, before the money could become tractors or pride or a night in town, Wes took the price of a single day's work in gold, 1 coin, and he put it in a blue mason jar in the cellar. Rain or drought, fat year or lean, 1 coin, and he'd hold it up to the cellar light and say it. "The land pays you slow, Opal, so take it slow. 1 coin at a time, and never let a loud year empty the jar." He died at 49, a tractor rollover on the north slope, and left her 42 years old with a mortgage, a jar with a dozen coins in it, and a county already measuring her for the auction. Opal had gone down to that same bank that same autumn to ask for the operating loan that would let her keep farming alone. The man who turned her down was named Wade Loomis, and he was a young loan officer then, and he did not get up from his desk. "Mrs. Renfrew, I'll be straight with you, as a kindness," he'd said. "A woman can't run that place alone. It's a mercy to say so now, before you lose it slow. Sell to the bakers, take the equity, move to town. Nobody'd blame you." He'd slid the denial across the desk the way you slide a thing you're glad to be rid of. Opal had taken it, and said thank you, and driven home, and not sold. She'd gone down to the cellar instead and held up the jar the way Wes used to and set his line to it in the dark. 1 coin at a time. Never let a loud year empty the jar. And the next fall, alone, she'd brought in the crop and put a coin in. She did it for 31 more years. She ran the 80 acres by herself the whole time, corn and beans and a truck patch she sold at the Saturday market. Nothing grand, nothing that made the county look twice, just a woman and her ground and the slow arithmetic Wes had taught her. She drove the old truck so she wouldn't have to touch the jar. She bought careful so she wouldn't have to touch the jar. Every autumn, before the money could become anything else, she took 1 coin's worth of the harvest and turned it to gold and carried it down to the cellar, and the county pitied her for being poor while the jar in the dark got heavier, year on year, 1 stubborn choice at a time. The setback came the year the county was surest she'd break, and it came at the thing she loved. It was a drought year, deep in her 70s, the worst she'd seen. The crop half failed. The truck died in the spring, and she couldn't afford to fix it and get the beans in both, and the property taxes came due, and for the first time in 30 years, Opal Renfrew sat at her kitchen table with the tax notice in one hand and knew she could not make it without going down to the cellar and breaking the jar. One coin would cover it. Just one. Wes wasn't there to say otherwise. It was only money, saved for nothing anyone could name, while the tax man wanted real dollars now. She went down to the cellar that night and took the jar in her lap and unscrewed the lid for the first time in years, meaning to take one coin, and Wes's line came to her turned all the way around. Never let a loud year empty the jar. But a drought isn't loud, she thought. A drought is the quietest year there is. Maybe that was the loophole. Maybe this was allowed. She sat on the cellar step a long time with the open jar in her hands and one gold coin between her fingers, 70-something and alone, and tired all the way to the bone, and the whole county's verdict rose up in her. Poor old Opal should have sold 30 years ago. And it would have been so easy to let one coin go. She didn't. She sold the dead truck for parts and got the beans in on a borrowed one, and she paid the tax with market money scraped to the dollar, and she screwed the lid back on the jar with every coin still in it, because she understood, sitting on that step, what Wes had actually meant. The jar wasn't savings. Savings you spend. The jar was a promise, and a promise you break once is broken. She carried it back to the dark and put a coin in that fall like every other fall, and told no one, and the county went on pitying her. The moment it clicked came the morning she finally carried the jar up out of the cellar and drove it to the bank, not because she'd broken, but because she'd finally found the thing worth opening it for. Wade Loomis was the branch manager now, gray and comfortable, 31 years on from the desk where he'd told a young widow to sell. He came up front when Nadine called, mildly annoyed, expecting some small confusion, and he saw the old woman and the heavy blue jar and did not recognize her at first. Then he did, and Nadine tipped the jar gently so the coins slid, and Wade Loomis looked down at 60 years of gold on his counter, and the color went out of his face. He knew what he was looking at. Any banker would. 60-odd one-ounce gold coins, bought one a year across 6 decades and never sold through every boom and panic that had swept every louder man's money away, worth, at that morning's price, more than the value of the good farms that had pitied her, well into the low 6 figures, and some of the older coins worth multiples of their gold besides. The teller had called her manager because she'd never seen a jar of gold. The manager had gone pale because he'd once looked this woman in the eye and told her she'd lose everything, and here was the everything, stacked on his marble, counted out in the stubborn patience he'd mistaken for poverty. "Mrs. Renfrew," Wade said, and his voice wasn't steady. "I don't. How long have you 60 years?" Opal said. "One at a time. My husband started it." She looked at him plain. "You told me once I'd lose the place. I've had a while to think how to answer that. I decided the answer wasn't worth the drive until today." The county heard about it the way a county hears things. The teller told someone, and the number got told, and within a week the whole feed store world that had pitied poor old Opal had to sit with the fact that the poorest-seeming woman among them had all along been the richest, not from luck, not from a windfall, but from 30 years of choosing the coin over the comfort while they drove their new trucks past her old one and shook their heads. But the part that stopped the branch for good wasn't the jar, it was what she'd come to do with it. Opal hadn't driven the gold to town to deposit it and be rich. She'd come because the Dawsons, the young couple who'd taken over the Baker place down the road, were 3 weeks from foreclosure, a hard start, a sick child, a note come due in a bad year, the exact spot Opal had stood in at 42. And the bank was about to take their farm the way it had nearly taken hers. She knew because it was the same bank. She'd done the quiet arithmetic. And she set the jar on the counter and told Wade Loomis she wanted to pay the Dawsons' note current and buy enough time for a young family to find their feet, the way nobody had bought it for her. Wade Loomis, who had once slid a denial across a desk to a widow, now sat across from that widow while she rescued somebody else's farm with the money his own advice would have cost her. He processed it himself. His hands weren't steady the whole way through. "Mrs. Renfrew," he said, when the papers were signed. I owe you an apology, 31 years old. You had a job, Opal said. You did it the easy way. A lot of men do. I could have believed you. You could have. And then, because Wes had not married a woman who kicked a man when he was down, you still can. There'll be another young family in that chair next year, and the year after. I can't save all of them. You can. If you've got the nerve for it now, that you didn't have then. That'd square us better than any apology. She let it sit, no barb in it. I'm not going to hold it over you, Mr. Loomis. I've spent 30 years not spending things. I can spare you that too. Wade Loomis didn't have an answer but to shake her hand, which cost him something, and the story goes that he was a different kind of banker after that more than one young family in a hard year found him easier to reach than the rule required, and that he never forgot the weight of a blue jar on his counter. The goods spread the way Opal's whole life had gone, quiet and real. The Dawsons kept their farm, and their sick child got well, and they named nothing after her because she asked them not to, only to do the same someday for someone else, which they promised, and which is the only kind of monument Opal ever wanted. She kept farming her 80 acres until she couldn't, and when she finally couldn't, she deeded them not to a developer, but to the Dawson kids to work. On the condition that every autumn, before the money became anything else, they'd take 1 coin's worth and set it by. She gave them the blue mason jar to start it, with 2 coins already in it, 1 for the year they were saved, and 1, she said, for Wes. She kept his line to the end. Some evenings, before she left the farm, she'd stand in the cellar doorway where the jar had lived 60 years in the dark, and say it to the empty shelf the way he'd said it to her. 1 coin at a time. And never let a loud year empty the jar. It hadn't been a big harvest that saved the Renfrew place, or a windfall, or a stroke of luck the county could envy and dismiss. It had been 10,000 small stubborn mornings and 1 refusal repeated for 60 years, the coin not spent, the jar not broken, the loud years survived quiet. A lifetime of little choices nobody thought worth noticing, adding up in the dark, until the day the smallest woman in the county set them on a marble counter and stopped a whole branch cold with the plain gold weight of a promise kept. If you've ever chosen the small stubborn thing over and over while everyone around you called it poverty, and lived to see what it quietly became, tell us about it in the comments. We read them all. The moral is as plain as a coin in a jar. Greatness rarely arrives loud. More often it's built the way a field is built, 1 patient morning at a time, by people the world mistakes for poor because it can't see what they're refusing to spend. The stubborn small choice, repeated long enough, becomes the thing that saves you, and, if you're the kind Opal was, the thing that saves somebody else. Tell us where you're listening from tonight, and about the person who taught you that little and steady beats loud and hungry every time. If this story reached you, share it with someone who's been quietly choosing the coin over the comfort sure no one sees. And whatever small, stubborn thing you're setting by in the dark right now, may you keep the promise through the loud years. May the jar grow heavier than they ever guessed, and may you live to set it on the counter one day and watch the whole room go quiet at what your patience became.